we urge delegations to insert fresh urgency to negotiations on reform. And in line with Africa's Ezulwini consensus, to improve on the balance of competence between the General Assembly and the Security Council. Mr. President, we are greatly concerned by the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine. We commend the Secretary General and all states and institutions for acting so promptly to offer relief to Ukrainians. It is also clear to us that our duty of care should include all people. Many countries have leveled unprecedented unilateral economic sanctions against the Russian Federation. Their implementation will likely lead to severe economic consequences, including a massive rise in inflation, the destruction of the hard-won savings of Russians, and widespread unemployment. We must also add the caution that such considerable sanctions, rather than opening the path to peace, may lead to an escalation and broadening of the conflict. The foremost need today is for bold statesmanship to redouble diplomatic efforts to steer us away from the rocky precipice we are being swept towards. Mr. President, finally, but no less importantly, and persisting in our call for non-discrimination in our humanitarian responses, we believe that we come together because we share a common humanity. For this reason, it has been deeply disturbing to observe the racialism that has characterized the expressions of solidarity in parts of Europe. Prominent figures in multiple media channels are expressing their solidarity in shockingly racist terms. Rather than join hands with the world, they are pushing the demeaning and inaccurate view that violent conflict only belongs to the global South. There is credible news of African students being made to stand in the back of the queue when getting on trains and buses to safety. At some border crossings, they have been treated in a racist and undignified manner. I do not doubt that there is a lot of deliberate and cynical misinformation driving this message to split our solidarity with Ukraine. However, the evidence of racist treatment is widely available and has been confirmed by several states in Africa and the Caribbean who are in contact with their citizens. We wholeheartedly condemn such racism against Africans and people of African descent. We resist any view that expressing these concerns is a distraction because the safety and dignity of African people will never be secondary to us. We reject racism at all times and in all places for its inhumanity, at the very same time as we denounce the illegal and inhumane nature of the war in Ukraine. Has racism not cost Europe tens of millions of lives? Has racism not led to catastrophes across the world? Why must it interfere with our solidarity today? I thank those countries neighboring Ukraine that are assisting Kenyan students make the border crossings. I urge them to redouble their effort to crack down on individual officials or units that may be reflecting attitudes and behaviors that are unacceptable. There is also a tide of sophisticated misinformation circulating that appears to seek to spark a broader conflict, including between nuclear-armed states. We urge all relevant organizations, including media houses and social media companies, to exercise caution in the management of information. I conclude on calling on the Russian Federation and all regional and international actors to settle this conflict by peaceful means in accordance with the United Nations Charter. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kenya. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Barbados.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the events of the last few days in and around Ukraine have been deeply disturbing both to the people of that sovereign United Nations member state and for all states members of this international community. These events have fractured the international order upon which all of our states depend for their safety and their security. Barbados aligns itself with the position set out by the Caribbean community on the 24th of February 2022. In that statement, the Caribbean community reaffirmed its commitment to respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, the prohibition on the threat or use of force, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. These principles are recognized by all as the central pillars of a peaceful and equitable international order. They are in keeping with the principled stance that Barbados steadfastly maintains in all of its international engagements, whether these are distant or within our own region. In this regard, the government of Barbados is gravely concerned by the actions taken by the authorities of the Russian Federation, especially those that have occurred since the 21st of February 2022. The actions of the Russian Federation are a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and of the rule of non-interference in the internal affairs of another state. They are a violation of the prohibition on the threat or use of force and of the rule that disputes between states should be resolved peacefully. The government of Barbados underscores the importance of the United Nations Charter and in particular Article 2.4, according to which UN member states agree to refrain from the threat or use of force against another state. Mr. President, these principles to which I have referred, to which all of us here have referred today, have an especial meaning for small states like my own, whose own existence depends not on our military might or our hard power, but on the respect and upholding of those principles. Barbados therefore calls upon the Russian Federation immediately to cease its hostilities and respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We reaffirm the essential role of diplomacy and multilateralism in de-escalating this spiraling crisis. And we completely support the efforts of the Secretary General of the United Nations and other legitimate mediators to find a peaceful solution. The government of Barbados firmly believes that a peaceful, negotiated, diplomatic approach which results in the restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is the only approach consistent with the values of the United Nations and with international law. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Barbados.
Now is the key intervention.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General. I would like to begin by thanking you for convening this special session under the Uniting for Peace resolution on this urgent issue. As we meet here today, Ukraine is under attack by a military offensive of the Russian Federation. This is a deeply concerning situation that we all sought to avoid. We join others in calling for the respect of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Mr. President, as a small state, the Maldives has always taken a principled stand on violation of territorial integrity of a sovereign country. We are firm that the respect for rule of law and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter are paramount and should be respected by all states, irrespective of their size or might. Mr. President, in 1989, the Maldives proposed and advocated for General Assembly Resolution 46/43 on the protection and security of small states. Our position stemmed from our bedrock belief in the equality of all states and unconditional respect to all the principles of the United Nations Charter, including the principles of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and non-interference in the internal affairs of the other countries, and peaceful settlement of disputes and their consistent application. The Maldives knows that in the face of a mightier adversary, we cannot rely on force, but instead must rely on international law, the UN Charter, and our multilateral system to protect us. We know we do not possess powerful weapons of destruction. Instead, we rely on our principles and the solidarity of nations that comes from unwavering adherence to these principles. Mr. President, in Ukraine, we have already witnessed death and destruction. The humanitarian situation is worsening, and we, like others, are concerned for the safety of all impacted civilians, including foreign nationals. In this regard, we seek support of the safe passage of Maldivian students from the region, and we welcome Ukraine's stepped-up efforts to assist foreign citizens wishing to return home. Mr. President, the prospects of an escalation of military conflict are troubling and will certainly bring about greater human suffering, destruction, and damage. At this time, we must exercise extreme restraint and caution and take constructive steps to diffuse tensions through dialogue. I would like to highlight that the government of Maldives has granted a special visa to Ukrainian tourists who intend to extend their stay in the Maldives to ensure their safety. Mr. President, the UN Charter places an obligation on all its member states to settle international disputes by peaceful means, without the threat or use of force. The Maldives encourages increased diplomatic efforts and confidence-building measures from all parties, including the United Nations, to resolve the current situation expeditiously and peacefully. Mr. President, looking back to the Maldives' very membership to the United Nations was being considered, looking back to when the Maldives' very membership to United Nations was being considered by the Security Council, a question was raised whether a mini-state could fulfill their obligations to uphold the Charter. Mr. President, today, the Maldives proudly stands to demonstrate its ability to fulfill its obligations to uphold the Charter as it has done since we became a member state. Mr. President, the Maldives will support the resolution before us. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Maldives. I now give the floor to the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, we are meeting today in this hall, once again, concerned by what is occurring in Ukraine. The drums of war are once again echoing in a continent which has suffered a great deal, a result of geopolitical ambitions. 2 world wars had to occur and more than 70 million lives had to be lost for us to realize that we had a need for a multilateral organization which would seek to preserve international peace and security. At the current time, we are seeing this core principle being completely violated, and we are crossing the point of no return, moving towards the loss of hundreds of innocent lives once more. Mr. President, Bolivia is a constitutionally peace-loving state, and we reject all wars of aggression and any and all threats of aggression as an instrument to solve disputes and conflicts between states. Within this constitutional framework, my country unequivocally rejected and continues to reject all invasions and unilateral actions undertaken by various powers throughout recent history. In so doing, these powers have undermined international law and the very Charter of the United Nations. Examples of such phenomena can be found in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Palestine, and today, Ukraine. Moreover, we would be remiss if we did not mention that in the conflict that is today of concern to humankind as a whole, there are responsibilities on the shoulders not only of the country that has decided to unilaterally undertake a military operation. There are also responsibilities on the shoulders of Western powers who, through NATO, jeopardize the security and peace of other states. They do so by using other states as middlemen to favor the expansionist ambitions of them as Western powers, and as such they threaten the security of their neighbors. NATO is not a guarantee of security. On the contrary, it is a threat to international security. We only have to remember the bombing of Yugoslavia, which occurred without the authorization of the Security Council. The result, after the atrocious crimes in the Balkan region, was a completely disintegrated country. Today, we observe with surprise the moral double standards shown by certain powers. Rather than seeking peace, they fan the flames of confrontation. Invasions and war must always be rejected, because all these invasions and war bring is death and destruction for humankind and for the lives of people. Against this backdrop, committed to international law and the United Nations Charter, we welcome the beginning of discussions on the border with Belarus between the delegations of Ukraine and Russia. This is light, a glimmer of hope indeed at the end of the tunnel, and we hope that these discussions will continue constructively and in good faith. We urge parties to exhaust all political and diplomatic mechanisms available, including mediation and negotiation, in order to find a peaceful solution to this conflict. Mr. President, we are aware that the current situation is the result of several factors that have played out over time, and we understand that there are legitimate security concerns on the part of those involved that must be heard and managed as best as possible, and this in order to avoid a more serious crisis in the region. We can't simply guarantee the security of some states to the detriment of the security of others. The international community has to be capable of building collective security. With that in mind, we appeal to all to avoid declarations or actions such as unilateral sanctions, which, instead of promoting dialogue, undermine any possibility of a peaceful solution. We believe that all relevant stakeholders must focus their efforts on ensuring an immediate cessation of hostilities, on protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure, and we call for the safe and unfettered access to humanitarian assistance to be allowed when required. Finally, we underscore the efforts undertaken by the Secretary-General to ensure that this situation does not further escalate, and we agree that what's happened so far is not irreversible action. We must not and we cannot throw in the towel in the face of weapons. The respect for life must prevail. The respect for international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter must guide us towards achieving a lasting and sustainable peace in the region. Many thanks, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of plurinational state of Bolivia. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, yesterday, the Russian president ordered his country's nuclear weapons to be put onto combat readiness. This was a clear escalation of a crisis that he himself initiated by launching an illegal invasion against a neighboring state. This unnecessary action, once again, brings to us the spectre of the use of nuclear weapons. This threat of the use of nuclear weapons is a violation of the UN Charter. It is also a violation of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But beyond violating international law and beyond the absolute failure of so-called nuclear deterrence are the lives of millions of innocent civilians that are being directly threatened by this atrocious, abhorrent strategy. We are returning to the idea of mutually assured destruction and to the prospect of a devastating global catastrophe. In Ukraine, Russian forces have already caused grave violations of international humanitarian law and perpetrated grave violations of international human rights law. They have used explosive weapons in populated areas. They have bombed residential areas, schools and a hospital. They have used cluster munitions, which are prohibited under international law. Civilians are being killed and injured. Civilian infrastructure is being destroyed. Thousands of civilians are fleeing on foot, seeking humanitarian assistance and shelter in subway stations. Cyber attacks have also been part of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. These have included the targeting of civilian infrastructure and the disruption of civilian life. We are seeing ongoing human rights violations and abuses in certain areas of the Donetsk, Luhansk areas and the Crimean Peninsula. These violations have included extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, abductions, politically motivated prosecutions, discrimination, harassment, intimidation, violence, including sexual violence. There have been arbitrary detentions and arrests, torture and ill treatment, and these are just some examples of violations of fundamental freedoms. Others have been reported. The repercussions of all of these abuses will be felt for a long time to come. The international community should keep a diligent record of all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law by the Russian Federation, and indeed by any other party. Mr. President, Costa Rica condemns the Russian Federation's decision to put its nuclear forces on high alert and into combat readiness, and we condemn its threat to use these weapons. We urgently demand that all nuclear forces be taken off alert. And Costa Rica, once again, calls upon nuclear weapon states to comply with their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Their obligations to pursue nuclear disarmament in good faith, and moreover, we urge all states to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which bans the development, possession, the threat of use and use of nuclear weapons. It also contains a framework for verifiable nuclear disarmament. Costa Rica urges humanitarian access. This access must be unimpeded, and we ask the President of the UN General Assembly to appoint a special envoy to act as the body's representative on humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees, and this in support of the work that UN agencies are already undertaking. This Assembly Costa Rica hopes to see, the safe evacuation of all those fleeing the conflict, including foreign nationals, workers, and students. Costa Rica condemns in the strongest possible terms the violations and abuses of international humanitarian law and human rights violations and abuses resulting from Russia's military invasion of Ukraine, and we call upon the Russian Federation to end these abuses immediately. And we call upon them to protect civilians and to stringently observe international human rights law and international humanitarian law. All members of the General Assembly must condemn the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and we must also support the ongoing diplomatic process seeking to achieve a diplomatic solution to this issue. We urge all states, all peace-loving states, to do just that. Above all, Costa Rica appeals for an end to this invasion. We call for an immediate ceasefire. We call for the swift withdrawal of troops and armed groups from Ukraine. And we call for all military actions against Ukraine to cease. If violence would only be put aside, we could return to peace and diplomacy. Mr. President, Costa Rica will vote in favor of this resolution. We will do so because we must reject a vision of the world whereby force is used to achieve foreign policy goals. We reject a vision of a world in which arms are prioritized along with violence. While lives of people and the very life of the earth is lost, it is vital to put an end to this aggression and invasion. But we must also put an end to the mentality that has brought us to this point. We cannot allow an attitude to develop whereby, in the face of attacks against the core principles of the United Nations Charter, the international community does nothing. We will vote in favor of this resolution to demonstrate unity and commitment to the core principles of international law, to demonstrate our commitment to peace and collective action, and to demonstrate that states can redraw a map of the world and that we can reshape history. We will vote in favor of the principles of the Charter now and in the future, and we will vote for the protection of Ukraine's sovereignty, for the protection of its territorial integrity, and for the protection of its citizens. Costa Rica unites with this front against the violation of the UN Charter, against the transgression and violation of various freedom. We unite against war, violence, and the violation of the territorial integrity of any UN member state. Let us vote so that the draft resolution that she's been proposed and that is being co-sponsored by a growing majority of this resolution can be passed. Let us all unite. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you. Mr. President, Secretary General, Greece allies to the statement delivered by the EU and wish to add the following in its national capacity. I will repeat what has been said time and again in this chamber. The UN Charter is clear. All states must refrain from threat or use of force. This is the guiding principle underpinning the UN Charter and all states should abide to it. Greece strongly and unequivocally condemns Russia's unprovoked attack against Ukraine. Greece remains steadfast in her staunch support to the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This attack is challenging fundamental concepts of international law, the inviolability of borders and the very right of sovereign states to choose their own orientation. Respect of international sovereignty, integrity and independence of all countries are fundamental principles of international law and the main pillars of Greek foreign policy. Violations of international law, no matter who they target, are threats to us all. This is why we can make no exceptions and must maintain a consistent stance across the board. Russia's aggressive military action constitutes a serious threat to the established rules-based international order. As such, it demands a unified response worthy of its magnitude. Revisionism is the main threat to world peace and will not be tolerated, no matter where it comes from. We are particularly alarmed by Russia's raising of the nuclear alert level. We cannot stand idle as the spectrum of nuclear destruction is looming. We call on Russia to de-escalate and to return to the previous alert level. We stand by the side of the Ukrainian people who are currently being faced with this tragic turn of events and are courageously fighting an unprovoked and unjustified military aggression by Russia. We are already counting a tragic toll of innocent victims, among which Greeks, injured people, internally displaced people and refugees. Mr. President, these deaths are unnecessary. This suffering is unnecessary. This attack is unnecessary. Attacks against all civilians in Ukraine must stop immediately. International humanitarian law is seriously challenged. Protecting and meeting the urgent needs of innocent civilians is of utmost importance. A centuries-long established Greek community of around 100,000 in Ukraine, concentrated mainly in the area of Mariupol, is already mourning victims. The brutal Russian attack against civilians in Sartana and Bugas towns near Mariupol resulted to the death of 10 members of the Greek community and left many injured, including children. Our consular authorities in Mariupol and Odessa remain operating in support of people in need. We strive to save lives. Greece, as an active member of the international community from the very beginning of this crisis, has mobilized in coordination with its partners and allies in order to project a unified and effective response. Our reactions and declarations condemning the Russian attack were loud and straightforward. The adoption of unprecedented sanctions which will hit the Russian economy in the substantial way has been swift. At the same time, together with our partners, we remain committed to address the grave humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in front of our eyes. There is no doubt that we are at the beginning of a new era and that the geopolitical turmoil that will ensue will have major consequences. But the price of freedom for which we must fight is very high. This Assembly has a historic responsibility to address the current attack. This is the only way to save the international rules-based order, to save the principles that unite us all in this room, the UN Charter, to stand for the cause of peace. Greece counts 201 years of independence, and in the struggle for freedom, our country has always been on the right side of history. We will continue in this direction. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Greece. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies. In the evening of the 23rd of February, 2022, sitting in the Security Council chamber, the Security Council being the primary organ of the United Nations that has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, Ecuador learnt with surprise and disappointment the news that military operations were beginning. The invasion of Ukraine was beginning, and that was a violation of the most fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter. Our disappointment was due to the fact that, as I stated before this plenary on the 23rd of February, when we were dealing with the agenda item on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, as I said then, I found value in all of these statements made before Security Council meetings held on the 31st of January, the 16th of February, and the 21st of February. And these last two sessions were held under the Russian presidency. My surprise in the chamber was a consequence of that disappointment, because we couldn't imagine that what we'd seen is a flagrant rejection of the commitments that all member states of this organization undertook to peacefully solve disputes, and to solve disputes using peaceful means alone. My country has demonstrated that it is a peace-loving state, and for decades has issued statements similar to those that I'm making before you today. Because peace is a part of our foreign policy, our conviction as a state, and we are fundamentally committed to international law and the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, and we believe that these are the only viable path towards peace, security and development for all peoples of the world. Consequently, I reiterate that historically it has been seen that the principles that inform all peace negotiations must leave the door open so that all those involved feel encouraged to resume the path of international law and that feel encouraged to produce authentic peace. To produce that authentic peace, you can't simply look at the present, you have to look at what inevitable future consequences of any action might be. This emergency special session of the General Assembly must serve as a precedent so that the reprehensible circumstances bringing us together here today do not reoccur, and must serve as a precedent so that if such incidents do reoccur, they are considered with the same seriousness by the international community and the General Assembly. I also wish to point to the humanitarian aspects of this conflict. War is essentially bad because it causes suffering for people and claims human life. Consequently, a widespread outrage has been seen and a widespread appeal has been launched for an immediate cessation of hostilities, because with every day that passes we are witnessing more horrific news. Ecuador has been unequivocal in its statements because we separate those who, with their conduct that violates international law, and we separate between those people whose conduct violates international law and those seeking to solve disputes. We support the initiative that France and Mexico have submitted to the Security Council in the humanitarian field, and we also support what the Secretary General has done, as well as what UNHCR has done, along with the IOM, the International Red Cross, and other organizations. We support all of these initiatives because they may avoid the worsening and of already catastrophic situation which is affecting citizens of many nationalities. As far as Ecuador is concerned, we have launched an emergency plan which seeks to ensure the security and personal protection of Ecuadorian citizens with international support. This plan has allowed us to remove from Ukraine students in particular, and we've allowed them to return to their countries, including Poland, Slovenia and other countries, and I thank the international community for its support here. I would conclude by recalling the basic premise inscribed on a plate that's on one of the walls outside this General Assembly room. And this premise states that in the life of relations between nations, respect for the rights of others means peace. With that in mind, I call upon all members to support the draft resolution which has been submitted for the consideration of this Assembly. Ecuador is one of the initial co-sponsors of this Uniting for Peace resolution. Mexico will not hesitate to vote in favor of this resolution because of its respect for international law and because of its respect for the principles which underpin the United Nations and the principles which consequently underpin peace, peace being a vital prerequisite for the security and development of humankind. Many thanks indeed for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ecuador. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, the international system which governs relations between states and peoples is underpinned by two principles, which, at the same time, are imperative commitments. The first of these is the obligation not to attack. In other words, the obligation not to use force or to threaten to use force against the independence, the sovereignty, and territorial integrity of another state. The second of these principles is the obligation to resolve disputes through peaceful means as provided for in international law. When these peremptory norms of international law are violated, peace is gravely violated as the result of an act of aggression. This is the situation in Ukraine, caused by the illegitimate use of force by the Russian Federation. This indeed is a use of force which does not only violate the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, but is a use of force whose grave consequence has been to replace a state of peace between two countries, even though there were clear tensions, replace that state of peace with a state of war. And this runs counter to the United Nations Charter and international law. Once again, Peru expresses in the strongest terms its condemnation for this act of aggression. Peruvian diplomacy has, since the country became an independent state in 1821, it built its external relations upon the principles of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of others and on the peaceful resolution of disputes. These are basic standards of American international law. And we have contributed to the gradual development of that law with our own conduct on the international stage. Our unequivocal condemnation of the aggression against Ukraine and our call for an urgent peaceful solution to the conflict is fully coherent with our own history. Equally coherent with our own history is our urgent appeal for the immediate, unfettered and permanent respect for international humanitarian law, in accordance with the provisions of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, conventions which protect non-combatants as well as civilian property and civilians. It is vital to protect the space we have for neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action. Peru endorses the appeal issued by the International Red Cross to urgently tackle the situation of refugees and internally displaced persons, and we echo their appeal for the urgent adoption of measures to protect infrastructure such as water, gas and electricity systems which meet the basic needs of civilians. This emergency special session of the General Assembly will adopt decisions. It will adopt historic decisions. It will adopt urgent decisions. And to use a somewhat verbose Spanish phrase, it will adopt decisive decisions, decisiones decisivas. The existence alone of conflict indicates to us that there are tasks we must confront immediately. These tasks are an immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of interventionist military forces, the protection of and the provision of assistance to the civilian population, and the peaceful and negotiated solution of the conflict. We support the efforts of the Secretary General to forge ahead along this path. The draft resolution on which this emergency special session will vote seeks to achieve these goals. Peru co-sponsors this resolution and supports it, and we do so with the firm belief that the peaceful and diplomatic solution of crisis is the path that ethics and law call upon us to follow. We note with hope that today has seen the beginning of meetings between the parties to the conflict. We ardently hope that vital initial agreements can be reached, such as a ceasefire. The United Nations Charter has as its core premise the idea that all states have the right to ensure that their existence in peace and security be protected, and that they have the right to be protected, but that right comes with the obligation to respect these same rights in other states. This inextricably linked nature of rights and obligations where peace and security are concerned is something we must remember, because it is the very core of our collective security system. The lasting solution to the conflict, which now dates back to 2014, must be based on the application of this principle and must seek to meet the legitimate aspirations of peace and security harboured by all parties. Allow me, Mr. President, to bring to the Assembly one of the core beliefs of Javier Pérez de Cuellar, who I think can be of guidance to us at the current time. He said that the seeds of war must be eradicated across the globe. He said that the post-Cold War global order can only be grounded in peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
Distinguished representative of Peru, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guatemala.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, Guatemala is a co-sponsor of the draft resolution Aggression Against Ukraine, because as a founding member of the United Nations organization, we firmly believe in the principles and values of the Charter which founded it. This Charter contains the pillars and purposes that are crucial, and the pillars and purposes that led to the inception of the United Nations. These are all pillars and purposes that as states that signed the Charter we committed to defending. My country would recall that this organization was created 76 years ago to protect future generations from the scourge of war. It was created so that the unspeakable suffering to which humankind was subjected in the First and Second World Wars never again recurred. Consequently, the maintenance of international peace and security is the most important pillar of our work. We must fully respect the fundamental rights of all human beings, prioritizing the life and value of every human person. It is clear that we are obliged to refrain from the use of force or the threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state. And it is clear that this applies to all states without exception. Mr. President, as a country, we shoulder the responsibility before several multilateral fora to support regional and global efforts designed to defend peace. Guatemala condemns in the strongest possible terms the military aggression and the unjustified invasion by the armed forces of the Russian Federation against the territorial integrity and the people of Ukraine. We condemn the flagrant violation by Russia of the United Nations Charter, of international law, and of international human rights law. We condemn the military decisions and actions of the Russian Federation, decisions and actions which have caused the senseless loss of human lives. The lives that have been lost include those of men, women, and children, and other people have been seriously injured. All are victims of this unjustifiable act which continues to threaten the region just as it does global stability and security. My country stands in solidarity with the government of Ukraine and particularly with its people. We call for collective actions and diplomatic endeavours such that the Russian Federation immediately ceases all aggression and all use of force against Ukraine and against any other state. We also call for the immediate withdrawal from illegally occupied territories so that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of this country is respected fully. We echo the diplomatic appeal issued to the Russian Federation to uphold its obligations as a member of the United Nations and a permanent member of the Security Council, because it has a responsibility to maintain international peace and security. Mr. President, it is of grave concern that the military operations of the Russian Federation have seen the launch of various types of missiles to the detriment of civilians. These actions have flagrantly violated international humanitarian law, and we've also heard that cluster munitions have been used. These have been internationally banned in light of the indiscriminate effects that they have. Guatemala firmly believes that these attacks are disproportionate and run counter to the basic norms which apply to all wars or conflicts. My delegation calls upon the Russian Federation not to continue with its military aggression and to halt this war. It must do so to avoid a situation whereby this brutal conflict has an impact on security in the rest of Europe and in the international community. Moreover, Guatemala expresses its grave concern at the news that the Chernobyl nuclear plant has been taken by Russian armed forces, and in light of that news we recall that any attack or threat of an attack against nuclear facilities dedicated for the peaceful use of nuclear energy is a violation of the principles of the United Nations Charter, a violation of international law and the statute of the IAEA. Moreover, Guatemala, in line with its position of principle, expresses its concern at the statements made by the Russian Federation and at the possible use of nuclear weapons. Guatemala staunchly believes that we still have time to return to the negotiating table, to diplomatic dialogue, and that we still have time to end the conflict. We cannot allow ourselves to repeat history. Guatemala is speaking out before this assembly in favour of life, in favour of peace, and in favour of global security, with the firm commitment to leaving a better world for future generations behind us. Thank you.
Thank the distinguished representative of Guatemala. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, last Friday, Albania and the United States of America submitted to the Security Council a draft resolution on the act of aggression Russia has committed and is committing against Ukraine. This act is in clear and blatant violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter of the United Nations, the obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state. 11 members of the Security Council voted yes. 1 country voted no, the aggressor. 81 states co-sponsored it, cross-regionally. We thank all those states for their support and for standing up to defend the values and principles and norms that make us friends, not enemies, that make us embrace peace, not aggression. We are here in the General Assembly today to continue our efforts and rally the world to condemn aggression and hold the perpetrator accountable. Dear colleagues, we stand in admiration before the courage of Ukrainians, men and women, defending their country, with whatever they have in a war that they did not choose. They are in their right, and they will prevail, since they know that never in history did Russian tanks win when they were not welcome. This time will be no exception. The Soviet Union is dead, and nothing, no fantasy, no nostalgia, no war will ever bring it back. We condemn the involvement of Belarus in this aggression against Ukraine and call on it to abide by its international obligations. As the Albanian Minister for Foreign Affairs stated yesterday, this war is more than just a war for the freedom of Ukraine. It is a struggle for the future of a democratic Europe, for the architecture of security and cooperation in our continent, as well as rules-based international order. Therefore, it concerns us all. Dear colleagues, Russia has been warned. If you go to war, you'll face severe and massive consequences, and it's happening. Albania has joined the concert of nations that has imposed sanctions and other restrictive measures against Russia. We have subscribed to the entire package adopted by the EU. We have closed our airspace to Russian operators, have joined the individual sanctions on the freezing of assets of individuals up to the Russian president, which will apply to 654 individuals and 52 entities. Economic sanctions include restrictive measures in finance, energy, transport and technology. Albania will no longer participate in any sport activity facing with the Russian Federation until Russia ceases its aggression against Ukraine. Also, given the worsening humanitarian situation, we have committed to shelter refugees. Dear colleagues, if we agree, willingly or by indifference, to let what is commonly agreed unravel in front of our eyes, as this act of aggression does, what respect do we have for what we have been building during 76 years since the World War II? What hopes do we cherish that we can continue to defend our rights individually and collectively? What assurance there is that we will not be condemned to be just a nameplate or just a dry number in this room? Instead, if we think and maintain that despite size, might or wealth, we are equal members and responsible actors of this Assembly of Nations, truly committed to uphold norms and values of our civilization, working for peace, harmony and cooperation, we need to show it. Albania has co-sponsored the draft resolution, and we call on all the members to do so. Russia must immediately stop its military actions, withdraw all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine, and respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence with its internationally recognized border. And I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Albania. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
إن ما يثير التساؤل بشأن
President, what's curious about today's session is that despite successive crises and major challenges that the international community has been facing for decades, and where the Security Council has failed to take on its responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, Western states have never demonstrated so much excitement in calling an emergency special session of the General Assembly. This shows a politics of hypocrisy, of double standards, as well as one based on interests and not principles. The memories and the files of the United Nations have ample proof of the many examples of illegitimate Western intervention and acts of aggression of the United States of America and their allies in NATO that have caused millions of innocent deaths in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Not to mention the blockades that have been imposed on a number of peoples in Latin America and elsewhere to achieve their objectives. We haven't seen much enthusiasm for a session such as today's back then, far from it, quite the contrary. My delegation believes that this historic emergency session on the situation in Ukraine completes the anti-Russian campaign that finds its origins in the provocative and hostile rhetoric towards Russia propagated by the West to stoke tensions in Ukraine and to thereby compromise the security and territorial integrity of Russia. Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic underscores the importance of resolving regional disputes and international ones through dialogue and diplomacy, and supporting the efforts to maintain security and stability around the world. We respect the principles of the United Nations Charter. The Syrian Arab Republic condemns the campaign organised and led by the West and their media against the Russian Federation. In particular, the deliberate spreading of fake news, of insidious allegations, as well as photos and videos that have been doctored, all of this to prevent Russia from exercising its natural right to defend its sovereignty and its security, as well as to protect its people in line with the UN Charter. Some Western countries have gone as far as closing down Russian media. They have banned them to prevent the public in Europe from finding out what's happening. Since the coup in 2014, Western countries have ignored the historic links between the Ukrainian and Russian peoples. They have also ignored the suffering of the inhabitants of the Donbass region, this suffering that has lasted many years. These states deemed it more important to give NATO a zone of influence at the gates of Russia, leading to suffering in Donetsk and Lugansk. When Russia launched a special operation to protect the people there, these same states began a campaign based on the UN Charter and what it qualifies as humanitarian suffering in Ukraine, setting aside the deep-rooted causes of the crisis that they themselves are responsible for. It is a paroxysm of political hypocrisy. Mr. President, the escalation of the situation between Russia and Ukraine comes from Western states not respecting their commitments towards Russia, and that's been going on for decades. These states have ignored the legitimate security concerns of Russia and have not hesitated to provide weapons and missiles to Ukraine, showing tireless generosity and downplaying the effects of their decisions on regional security and stability. Nonetheless, the Russian Federation has always made pragmatic proposals and has demonstrated restraint in the face of American and European attempts, as well as those of NATO, to exacerbate the situation. These proposals, though, have been ignored, and Russia's security concerns have not been taken seriously. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, this is what the United States and the West are resorting to once again: coercive measures, unilateral coercive measures, in contravention of international law and the UN Charter. These measures are simply fanning the flames and harming the people in the region. My country condemns the punitive measures and believes that being on the right side of history means rejecting the West's bellicose policies in order rather to preserve the interests of the peoples who oppose them and opposes their interventionism. Thank you.
Representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Mr. President, India is deeply concerned that the situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate. We reiterate our call for immediate cessation of violence and an end to hostilities. All member states of the United Nations are not only obliged to follow the UN Charter, but also respect international law and territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. Peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with these principles has been India's consistent position that has stood the test of time. As such, my government firmly believes that there is no other choice but to return to the path of diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi has advocated this strongly in his recent conversations with the leadership of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. In this regard, we welcome the commencement of direct talks between both sides. We reiterate our firm conviction that all differences and interests can only be bridged through honest, sincere, and sustained dialogue. There is an urgent and pressing humanitarian situation developing in Ukraine. The international community needs to ensure free and uninterrupted humanitarian access and smooth movement of all peoples. Keeping in view the humanitarian requirements in Ukraine, my government has also decided to provide urgent relief supplies, including medicines. These are expected to be delivered soon. India is doing whatever it can to undertake immediate and urgent evacuation efforts of Indian nationals who are still stranded in Ukraine. The safety and security of Indian nationals, including a large number of students, remains our top priority. The complex and uncertain situation at the border crossings is adversely impacting the uninterrupted and predictable movement of people. This important humanitarian necessity must be immediately addressed. In this regard, I would like to thank all neighboring countries of Ukraine who have opened their borders for our citizens and given all facilities to our missions and their personnel to evacuate Indian nationals to their homeland. We stand ready to help those from our neighbors and developing countries who are also stranded in Ukraine and may seek assistance. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Chile follows other speakers speaking at this historic session. During this historic session, the General Assembly will have to take action to guarantee international peace and security. The very fact that this is the first time in decades that the Assembly is meeting in this format bears witness to the exceptional nature of the situation and to the frustration of the international community at the paralysis of the Security Council and its failure to adopt a decision in favour of peace, a decision required by the current situation in Ukraine. As Chile indicated in the meeting of this Assembly on the 23rd of February, my country in its international relations adheres to the principles enshrined in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. As such, we unequivocally reject the use of force or the threat of use of force in international relations. Disputes between states must be resolved by exclusively peaceful means, in accordance with the letter and spirit of the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, Chile will support and also co-sponsors the resolution which is submitted in this special session of the General Assembly, a resolution which condemns the aggression against Ukraine. We urge for the immediate cessation of this aggression. We call urgently for the withdrawal of occupying troops, the protection of civilians, and for access to humanitarian aid. We call for the respect of the full territorial integrity of Ukraine. And we call for the recognition of the independence of the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk to be left without any effect whatsoever. In light of the above, Chile also co-sponsored the resolution which was presented last Friday before the Security Council. At the same time, I underscore that our national position on this situation has been publicly expressed by the highest authorities of my country and in the government's official communiques. Moreover, we are encouraged to learn of the beginning of direct discussions between the parties with a view to putting an end to the occupation in Ukraine. The international community, through this General Assembly, is observing these discussions and is ready to support them with its efforts to ensure that international law and peace prevail. Mr. President, we are still living with the pandemic and we are seeing an increase of poverty and precarity in so many regions of the world, and we also are facing the challenge of climate change. In light of the above, we need unity now more than ever before, and we need this organization now more than ever before to uphold its obligations. We need to champion our effective cooperation so we can achieve a better present and a dignified future for future generations. I conclude my statement, Mr. President, by recalling the Preamble of the United Nations Charter. It states, "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." And it continues, "Consequently, we will ensure by the acceptance of principles that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest." Many thanks, Mr. President and Mr. Secretary General.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers tomorrow morning, 1st March, in this hall at 10 a.m. The meeting is adjourned.